30 seconds. Hello. Hi. I want to welcome everybody to our first lecture of the Interfaith Lecture Series of this year. There will be another one in September. Last year we had three. If you may remember, we had one on James Baldwin, one on Muslim communities today, and one about hymn writing. Well, all of them were really exciting. And this one will be equally exciting. But Professor Barbara Ambros is professor of religious studies, chairman of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research on Japanese religion focuses on gender studies, human-animal relationships, and place and staff. Her publications, and I think you see three of them there, include Bones of Contention, Animals and Religion in Contemporary Japan, and Animals and Religion. The last two published 10 years ago and about just a couple of years ago. And another one, which I don't have, but an earlier book, whose title is, she doesn't have any books with her, but if you're interested, they're all available on Amazon. So interest you. This what we're doing now is a joint venture of a whole number of religious institutions in the area. They include the Brevard Jewish Community, the Brevard First United Methodist Church, St. Timothy United Methodist Church, the Sacred Heart Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd, Bethel A Baptist Church, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, and the Unitarian Universalists of Transylvania County, as well as the Center for Spiritual Wisdom. My name is Howard Rock, and I used to be president of the BJC, but right now I'm still head of in this case, I'm along with Pastor Andrew Griffin of the St. Timothy's, we are the co-chairs of this year's speakers, and we're really delighted to have you with us. So, without further ado, we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards and a dialogue, but first we want to hear her talk, which is, as you know, titled, you have it right there, Beyond the Rainbow Bridge, Animals as Religious Subjects in Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism. Professor Ambros.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Howard, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out on this very gloomy and rainy day. I hope you will enjoy this afternoon, and if you have questions, please feel free to ask. What I'm going to talk to you about is related to my interest in animals and religion. I am a member of the steering committee on animals and religion at the American Academy of Religion. And one of the things that we really care about in that particular unit of the AAR is that we talk about animals not just as religious symbols. That's something that a lot of people are aware of, say in Abrahamic traditions, that animals can be religious symbols, but we're also interested in actually living animals as actual beings. And for me, the way that I approach this as a scholar of East Asian religions is that I often look at rituals, because animals and actual living animals often play a big role in ritual. And the kinds of rituals that I'm talking to you about today are three types of rituals. When you think animals and rituals, a lot of people start thinking, oh, sacrifice, right? And that's a touchy subject. I think in a lot of times, particularly in the modern West, sacrifice, people kind of look at that with abhorrence, and they don't quite fully understand it. So I won't take us to the most, I think, challenging and difficult subject to deal with, but I'll take you to some that are perhaps a little bit easier to wrap our heads around, and then maybe when y'all said and done, I'd be happy to also answer some questions about sacrifice if you have them. But the traditions that I've covered today, Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism, at least in their modern iterations, often don't like sacrifice that much, even if they use sacrificial language. So we'll look at some other rituals. Okay, let me get started. So one story that I want to start out with is a story that's set in the Japanese past in the 6th century, and it deals with a warrior by the name of Toribe Yorozu, who got into a conflict with the Japanese reigning sovereign. During the time period when Buddhism was introduced to Japan, he was on the losing side, and he found himself stuck in a thicket, and troops had surrounded the thicket. He was trying to hide out there with his dog. And he was pretty crafty, so he tied some ropes to some bamboo stems, and he pulled on them, so people thought he was here and there, and they couldn't find him. But eventually they found him, and they shot him in the leg, and then he still tried to defend himself and killed a whole bunch of people. But eventually they got him, and he was surrounded, and he lamented that he was always loyal to the sovereign, but here he found himself on the losing side, and he killed himself by stabbing himself in the throat. And because he was on the wrong side and deemed a disloyal subject, it was ruled that his body should be dismembered and not be allowed to be buried, and his head was chopped off, and his dog wouldn't leave his side, his white dog, and ran off with the head and buried the head and sat next to the place of burial and starved himself to death. People, including the reigning sovereign, were so moved by this act of loyalty and righteousness that they allowed Yorozu to be buried. And when the dog was buried next to him, so to this day, Yorozu's descendants have these 2 burial sites. There's Yorozu's grave with the headstone, and the dog buried nearby. So I want you to think of that as a setting, the start of the talk. So when we think about animals and religion, and if you say let's take Christianity and Buddhism as 2 different ways of approaching this topic. In Christianity today, you might say, well, airports may be pet friendly, but the hereafter is not. If you look at traditional views, animals are assumed to not have immortal souls, and therefore they have no access to heaven. That's sort of a problem. The modern solution then to say is, well, if that's the case, we can still focus on them as God's creation. So you turn to creation rather than the hereafter if you want to celebrate animals. Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, takes a slightly different route. In Buddhism sort of assumes that all living beings circulate through different rounds of rebirth, and all are assumed to have Buddha nature. So that means animals too have karma, and that can go in different directions. And they can achieve spiritual progress and a better rebirth. And because of that, animals have spiritual potential. It is not just this life, but other lives and previous lives, and a sense of kinship with animals, because you as a human might also end up finding yourself in the animal realm. So that means that animals very well might reach some kind of higher form of rebirth before you as a human. That means we also have some responsibility and kinship responsibility toward them in kinship with them. And some of these stories are really interesting. There's a story from the Tang Dynasty set roughly in the 8th century about the parrot of Hedong. It's a very famous story about Mr. Pei, who has this parrot that he teaches to recite the name of Amitabha, so one of the Mahayana Buddhas that resides in the Western Pure Land, and that usually saves anyone who recites his name. And the parrot learns to recite Amitabha's name. So when the parrot eventually nears the end of his lifetime, his owner encourages the parrot to recite the name of Amitabha as he's about to die. That is an ideal death. So the parrot does this as his keeper sort of strikes a percussion instrument to get the right rhythm. And when the parrot has recited the name about 10 times, he drops over dead. So they cremate the parrot, and in the cremated remains, they find over 10 relic beads. So when somebody is very, very spiritually advanced and gets cremated, there's this idea that they leave behind these little glass formations that are a sign of their spiritual the advancement. And so in the parrot's cremated remains, they find these relic beans indicating that that parrot has reached a higher spiritual state. And that gets memorialized. It's a very famous story. And sometimes in the Japanese tradition, too, you find even stories such as, let's see if we can go to it, such as this one here of a dog that recites, also chants the sutras along. Oops, I was actually in the wrong slide, so that is okay. I guess I'll just use the clicker instead. So this is a story of a dog that actually sides along the sutras, or the name of Amitabha, howling along with the Buddhist monks, and similar kinds of miracles happen. So that's an assumption that exists in the Buddhist tradition. Perhaps that seems kind of somewhat unusual if you come at it from a Christian perspective. Now, the 3 types of rituals that I want to look at today are blessings of the animals, releases of captive animals, and rituals related to animal death. And I think these rituals often reveal a lot of things about how each tradition views animals. And I think there are some similarities that we find, but also very concrete differences because of the worldviews that each of these traditions actually holds. One thing that often happens when we deal with rituals, that we might say, oh, there's this ritual and it does certain things, but when we look at how animals are really treated, that is very different in reality. So the ritual is hollow and it doesn't mean anything. I would say that's a very simple way of approaching ritual that misses a really important point. And there's a really interesting thinker of religion. The clicker is not fast forwarding. Oh, there we go. Thank you. A really interesting scholar by the name of J.Z. Smith, who passed away just a few years ago. And he wrote an essay called The Bare Facts of Ritual. In that, he says, ritual is a means of performing the way things ought to be in conscious tension to the way things are, in such a way that this ritualized perfection is recollected in the ordinary, uncontrolled course of things. You can read that a couple of times, but what that basically means, that ritual gives us, in a sense, an ideal way that things ought to be in this world, and we know very well that they are not that way. That when we go about our everyday daily lives, perhaps something changes in us, that we try to be a little closer to that ideal way things should be in this world. And I think that, rather than approaching ritual very cynically as just this ideal thing that never works out in the real world, I think that is actually more useful. That is coaching us towards something ideal, rather than necessarily always achieving a complete ideal thing and otherwise being completely useless. So when we think about ideas about creation, perhaps in the Christian tradition and also somewhat similarly in the Abrahamic tradition, in the Christian approach, most Christians would say that animals have no mortal souls, and this creates a spiritual void when beloved pets die, because then how do you deal with that in a religious context? A lot of times in a lot of Christian denominations, funeral rites focus on the resurrection or eternal life. If you assume that animals don't have that, then you can sort of have a funeral and in the same kind of sense for an animal. So you can't apply these concepts to animals without contradicting very fundamental issues in theology. The solution then is to shift the focus from salvation to creation, to particular religious figures such as Saint Francis, who is often associated with animals, or focusing on Noah and Judaism and Noah's Ark, and bring animals into the sanctuary through these strategies. You also emphasize God's love for all creation and human responsibility as stewards, rather than focusing just on salvation as a promise. Now, in the Buddhist framework, you often find that there's an emphasis on kinship across different species and different life forms, that all animals were once our parents in former lives, that killing and eating animals is like killing your own family, and that all beings are made of the same fundamental substances. Animals exist in some kind of realm of beasts, which is lower than the human realm, but they can still accumulate good karma. They can get out of this reborn as humans or reborn even as divinities. And they may even be thought to be able to go to some kind of paradise and reborn there in some other kind of form. And that influences how some of these rituals approach the ultimate goal. So, the first ritual that I want to start with is blessings of the animals. So historically speaking, and some of you, that may be the ritual that most of you are familiar with because it's actually practiced at in a lot of different religious communities. Historically speaking, initially, if you go back to the medieval period, blessings of the animals were usually for farm animals, and they were usually associated with St. Anthony. And see, that's what you see in this image here, St. Anthony blessing livestock. And you still find this in some countries like Italy and Spain and Mexico, that tradition persists. Is usually the feast day of St. Anthony is in January, I believe, and that's when you would actually have these blessings of the animals. But in modern animal blessings that you see celebrated around the United States is usually celebrated around the feast day of St. Francis. So St. Francis is also known as as the saint who preaches to the animals. And so that makes it actually a really good choice to have a blessing of the animals. And perhaps the most famous blessing of the animals, it's not forwarding. Can you go to the next slide for me? There we go. So the most famous blessing of the animals may be perhaps the blessing of the animals at during the St. Francis Day service at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And you can see here some images that includes not only family pets, but also rather exotic animals like snakes and camels. And you might say, wow, that's a religious service that is where they have a massive procession that comes into the church, and the doors are open for that. But it's also a bit of a spectacle in its own right. After the service, the animals are blessed in the park outside afterward. And those kinds of services you find throughout the United States, particularly in Episcopal churches, but also now in some other denominations. And for the liturgy, very often there may be things like there's a song of creation, a Bible reading about God making all creatures, prayers, thanks to God for the gift of animals, an emphasis on human responsibility to care for creation. But there isn't really anything about the animal afterlife. That's not really necessary. You can bless the animals, they can be part of the service. For the Episcopal Church, they actually adopted an official liturgy for these events in 2012. Go to the next slide. But you find them in many congregations, and including if you go to Chapel Hill at the Chapel of the Cross. I attended one actually with my husband, Christian, who you see in one of the images on the bottom here. There he is with our two dogs. And some of these, they're celebrated in different ways. If you look at the service at the Chapel of the Cross, it's very similar to what you see, say, at St. John the Divine. There's a service outside, then the animals are led inside the church, and they're blessed inside the church, and then everyone comes outside. It's a very social event, but it can also lead to animal mishaps. So when they had this one, it was very good that they didn't have a nice carpeted space like this, but they actually have slate tiles in the church, in the sanctuary, because they let a big horse in, and the horse had a little potty accident right in the aisle, and they came out with the mops. So that was fine. I think that is an issue sometimes for these services. So some other settings, for instance, that is at Duke Chapel. I think that has a longstanding Methodist connection, although it's now, I think, not entirely just Methodist. But they had the blessing outside, so they didn't actually go into the sanctuary because it makes it much easier to navigate. If you look very closely to what one of our dogs is doing there, right there, here, she's peeing. So this is just what happens when animals are in the sanctuary. You have to deal with it. They're just animals. They're not realizing that they're in some space where they're not supposed to go. Now, what's interesting is that as I said, this has spread across different Christian denominations, but you also find that there are Jewish communities that also hold blessings of the animals, and they might find other kinds of contexts for which they do this. So one common one is right around Parshat Noach, when they are reading the passage about Noah and the ark and the Torah. That's a good time in October to also hold that service. I mean, it's somewhat a double-edged sword because the story of Noah doesn't end at the end very positively for the animals. So maybe some other congregations might like to choose a different time. So for instance, some do it during the seventh day of Passover to celebrate sort of being liberated, that the Hebrews and the animals were liberated, and their animals were liberated. There may also be other kinds of occasions during the year when it's celebrated, but very often it's during Parshat Noach. Another thing that you find sometimes within the Jewish tradition is something that you may have heard of, and that's the bar mitzvah. That has been around. That's been around. I think it's been documented since the 1950s, but it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's a way to come together and celebrate your pet when your pet reaches the age of 13. And life cycle rituals are an important thing in a lot of traditions. So to show you something different, life cycle rituals, you also find these in Japan. So within Shinto, life cycle rituals are a very common thing. Shinto, modern Shinto, is basically often associated with celebrations that mark certain kind of transition in the life cycle, particularly birth. And then for children, what you see here is the 753 celebration for dogs and cats, because children are taken to a Shinto shrine when they're 3, 5, or 7 years old. So you can also do that with your pet at this particular shrine. This shrine is the Zama shrine that's in a city that's near Tokyo. And in the back of it, it has this small shrine that's called the Inoneko Jinja. It's written with different characters that don't necessarily say dog and cat, Inu and Neko. But it basically means the dog and cat shrine. And they hold 753 celebrations for dogs and cats. You can also bring them for New Year's visits, as you can see here, to open up good fortune. You can bring them to the cat and dog shrine, and you see this right here in the center slide, a dog and his owner visiting the Inoneko Jinja shrine behind the main sanctuary. There are other things that they offer that would normally be available for humans at a Shinto shrine. And that is, for instance, fortune-telling slips, but here for your cats and dogs. Normally a fortune-telling slip is called omikuji, is really about personal fortune, particularly romance. So you want to know, are you going to be lucky to find your partner in life? Well, that's a little different for cats and dogs. Humans are usually interested in their relationship with their pets, so it actually tells you about the fortune in relationship to humans and their pets. So that would be one thing. And then also shrines usually sell amulets. In the human case, a lot of them are for health and safety of various kinds, also success in business and say in school. The latter concerns are not that important to pets, but health and traffic safety are transferable. So you find actually these amulets that you can get at the Zama shrine for pets to get good health and traffic safety, so they're protected. They also have these plaques. You see these wooden plaques with prayers. Those kind of plaques are also used for humans, and you pray for the same kind of things, same kind of concerns. And you see here a lot of them pray for health for the pet. And in this case, the plaques are actually animals shaped, and they're very cute. So you put them up right by the cat and dog shrine, you hang those plaques. Now, let me get to the next. So the next ritual that I want to introduce is perhaps a little bit exclusive to the Buddhist tradition. I don't think there's quite the same kind of parallel in the Abrahamic traditions, but there's a ritual for releasing captive animals. That's basically a ritual intended to save animals that would otherwise be condemned to death. And the one story that emerges very early on that becomes sort of the key story that's sometimes told is about a young monk who is basically a novice under a senior monk. And the senior monk is very advanced, so he can actually read people's future. And he looks at this young monk and he realizes this young monk's about to die in 7 days, and he takes pity on him. Monks in the Buddhist tradition are also known as home leavers. So this novice has left behind his family. But a senior monk knows that he's about to die, so he says, well, why don't you go home and visit your parents? Go and visit them. Because he thinks like, oh, he's going to die. His parents will be very happy to see him one more time. So he sends him home. But on the way, the young novice comes across some ants that are being swept away by flooding water because rain is pouring down. So this young monk feels pity for these poor ants, and he takes off his Buddhist robe and tries to rescue them out of this raging torrent of water, and he rescues all these ants. And then he goes to visit his parents, and then he walks back to the monk and says, "Hi, I'm back." And the monk is all surprised because he has expected him to be dead already. And he looks at him and he sees that his lifespan has been extended. He's perfectly fine. He said, "What happened?" He said, "Oh, yeah, well, nothing special. I guess on the way I rescued some ants." He accrued good karma. And that because he saved the lives of all these beings, his own life was extended. So often you see that people did these rituals to release captive animals, to save the animals' lives, and accrue good karma for these animals and themselves. And that was usually assumed to also help you extend your own lifespan. The typical, the two texts that were usually seen as foundational texts that undergirded this ritual, which emerged in China. So there's not a ritual that existed in India, but they usually like to cite some Buddhist texts as a scriptural justification for creating a ritual. And one of them is the Golden Light Sutra. And it tells the story about a person called Jalavahana. And that was supposed to be the Buddha in a former life, who comes across a pond in the middle of a forest that's being drained of water. And there are all these dying fish in the pond. And he runs around and he tries to save the fish and he can't do anything. So he goes to the king and he says, "Can I borrow your elephants so that we can carry some water to the pond in these pouches to save the fish?" And he said, okay, this king lends him the elephants. And he fills up the pond with water. And then he sees that the fish are hungry. So he sends his son back to his house to gather all the food for the fish. And he feeds the fish. And then the fish are kind of swimming around and following him around. And then he goes like, okay, let me preach to them. So he starts preaching to them the teaching of dependent origination. So that's basically how karma happens. And then the fish seem to be satisfied, and he goes back home, and there's some sort of disaster. All the fish die, and they're reborn in heaven, in Triyastrimsa heaven, the heaven of the 33. And you see this image here actually of him dreaming, and these heavenly beings come to him and shower him with flowers out of gratitude. So that is one story that's seen as a scriptural foundation of releasing, saving living beings. And the other one is seen as a text that's called the Brahma's Net Sutra that probably originated in China pretty early on, but always claimed to be written in India. And the word of the Buddha, but probably it was not. It was a text that was actually created in China. It shows very Chinese concerns. But it's basically a text that lays out various precepts, the 10 major precepts, and then a whole set of 48 minor precepts. And among the minor precepts, there's one that promotes releasing living animals. That's the 20th precept. And it basically says all beings were once a mother and a father. And all beings are made from the same four substances. So when I kill them, I'm either killing my parents or I'm killing myself. So I should not do that. Instead, I should release them so that generates merit and compassion and will help all of us, including the animals, to be either reborn in the Pure Land or in some celestial realm. So we'll have better rebirth. So it's good for all of us. And there's another precept, the 45th minor precept, that basically says, when you encounter in any kind of village or hamlet or city, if you see any living being, you should encourage those living beings to take the 3 refuges that basically says, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Buddhist teachings, and I take refuge in the Buddhist community. and to take the 10 major precepts, starting with I vow not to kill, I vow not to lie, I vow not to slander the Buddha, and so forth. So there's 10 major ones. Some of them are similar to the 10 commandments, but some are also a little bit different. But you should encourage all living beings to embrace the 3 refuges and the 10 precepts. And then also when you encounter animals in particular, you should encourage them to arouse the aspiration for enlightenment. You should say, you are an animal, you should arouse the aspiration for enlightenment. That's really extraordinary. And if you violate that, any of these things, you commit an offense that is not becoming of a bodhisattva. So those are the 2 texts that are usually seen as foundational for the ethos of life, releasing living beings. Those became major rituals in China and then also later in Japan. And I've witnessed some of these. Usually people would purchase animals about to be killed, very often small animals such as fish and turtles or birds. They perform a ceremony with chanting and prayers in which the animals were assumed to be ritual participants. So, but animals cannot speak. Yet they were in that ritual assumed to take the 3 refuges. So I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Buddhist teachings, and I take refuge in the Buddhist community. How could you make that happen if the animals can say that? Well, you as human participants can speak on behalf of the animals. So the human participants would say it and say, on behalf of the animals, we take refuge. And you perform certain kind of ritual segments which assume that it opens up the ears of the animals so that even though they cannot speak, they understand what's going on, even if they normally cannot. They've been purified with purified water, and then you open up the ears so they can hear what you're saying. And then the participants even do a repentance, where they repent all their misdeeds to basically let go of all this karma that they have accumulated that ended up landing them in the realm of animals, which is not a very good rebirth. So that when you release them and you save their lives, you've not just saved their lives, but you've actually improved their karma. And that's important to keep in mind. A lot of people, when they look at life releases, they reject them as kind of problematic, which they are, ecologically speaking. However, they're also very much understood to transform these beings and the human sponsors karmically. So keep that in mind. So here are images of 2 life releases in Japan that I attended. One is at a temple called Midera, and you see the Buddhist monk actually sprinkling enchanted water and saying a blessing over the turtle that's about to be released. And the other one is in Kyoto, the Gion life release in Kyoto at a small river called the Shirakawa, which leads into the Kamo River that runs, a big river that runs through Kyoto. Now, what happens with a life release such as the one in Kyoto? We can also see some of the problems for these animals. The one that I attended was a really joyful event. They were releasing 2,000 small sweet fish, which is a local species that's native to that area, into the Shirakawa River. And they got these young fish from a fish farm not too far away. It was a beautiful ceremony with speeches, music, and prayers. The fish were kept in a tank that was shaded from the sun. They had introduced the water from the river into the tank. So they were clearly taking care of the fish so that they would not die prematurely. They gently placed them in buckets, and then you can see they were pouring the fish with the water into the river during the release. And the fish darted around the river afterward they were being released. It was all wonderful. But then the people who were releasing them, as well as myself, were also aware that downstream a heron had been waiting. Actually, I had noticed that heron when I arrived a little bit early. I saw the heron flying overhead and landing in the river as if it kind of knew what was going to happen. And it had a field day. It gorged itself on these newly released small fish. And it spent about 2 hours gorging itself until the ritual had finished, and then flew off. That was so I started walking, and the heron started also flying away. And it actually followed the Shirakawa, as did I, walking back to the Kamo River. And at the mouth of the river, it landed. And this were where the remaining fish were coming out. And all these crows gathered, and all these birds started again eating all the fish. So we might say, was that ritual meaningless? It's a big question, and I think a contentious one. Was it ecologically harmful? We don't really know. Probably not. They had put some thought into it. When they first started it, they were releasing small koi carp in the 80s. Then in the 90s, there was a worldwide koi herpes pandemic. And they quit releasing koi because the herpes virus had also been found in that river. So they switched to goldfish, which are more hardy and resistant to that particular virus. And then in 2011, I don't know, you must remember this, that terrible tsunami and earthquake happened in northeastern Japan, and then the nuclear accident, so the triple disaster. A lot of people perished. And for some reason, when people thought about having this release in the Shirakawa River in Kyoto, even though it is in western Japan, they thought about all the people who had lost their lives, and the red fish reminded them of blood. So they did not want to do that. So instead, they switched to a silver species, the sweet fish. So ever since then, they've been releasing the sweet fish during that ritual. So there were some ecological, some cultural considerations about which species they were going to release. And these particular species, the ayu or sweet fish, are local to that area. So whether or not that causes an ecological disaster is uncertain, probably not, especially because a lot of them get picked up by predators right after. So maybe that's actually not a bad thing that some of them get eaten. Now, if you look wider across East Asia and globally, life releases are ecologically highly problematic. A lot of people buy stuff at market. That is the usual and the traditional thing to do. And perhaps in the pre-modern era, without a global marketplace, that was not an issue. But nowadays, a lot of the live animals that you would buy at market are not native species. And people don't necessarily take that into consideration when they release them. So often releasing live animals leads to the introduction of non-native species and that end up being invasive species. So North American bullfrogs have been released in southern China and have led to all kinds of problematic issues. Then the Mississippi sliders have been pet animal, have been released all over the place, including Asia. They now also have invaded various kinds of Asian ecosystems. So it's, and some Asian species have been released into the United States through these means. So it is sort of a problematic issue. And perhaps the people who celebrate these particular life releases don't always take that into consideration. Sometimes they do. So in the case of Midera, for instance, they only release a native species called the ishigame, or the pond turtle. That's a native species to Japan, and that's gradually losing its habitat. So the temple started releasing turtles that have been rescued from places that are not very safe for those turtles. And they started a turtle breeding program on the temple grounds where they also breed these turtles, and they're released into a pond onto temple grounds, and they don't advertise this, but when I arrived, the pond was empty. There's nothing in it. So I'm pretty certain that they collected all the turtles, put them in a container, and then they were released back into the pond. Turtles are particularly long-lived, and because of their longevity, they're also seen as an auspicious species. And so what people did is you could sign a book with a child's name, your child or a child in your family, and then you would write the name of the child on the shell of the turtle with a child's age, and then the cleric would pray over the turtle, and you'd release it with a piece of bread. So you're kind of reenacting a similar ritual as the story of Jalavahana and the Golden Light Sutra, released and fed the fish. So that is perhaps not particularly ecologically problematic. Is it good for animal welfare that the turtles are connected, put in a bucket where they're not very happy? And the turtles doesn't seem that happy. Did it harm them? Probably not. So I leave it up to you. But I remind you, again, of J.Z. Smith's words that the ritual is enacting some kind of ideal reality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's ideal in real life. It's an aspiration, that you're working toward an ideal compassion, releasing the animals, hoping that they're happy when they're being released into the wild. How long they live, and if they die a natural death, you've also prepared for their salvation through this ritual, the performance of this ritual. So it has actually aspiration. So let me turn to the last ritual that I want to discuss, which is funerals and commemorative rituals for animals. Now, I told you the story of the parrot of Hodon, and who was given actually a memorial stupa, and when cremated also produced relics. So there were funeral rites and memorial rites conducted in a sense. So even in medieval China, such rituals are documented. If you think of the story I told you about Yorozu's dog, who is also buried near his master, there were rituals carried out, some kind of memorialization of this dog. So that has an old history in East Asia. And you find other examples, liturgies that they found at Donghang. So in the Gobi Desert, there's an oasis, Donghang, that's very famous because they discovered in the modern era these caves with this library with all these Buddhist texts and other kinds of religious texts, Manichaean, Taoist, even some Christian, Nestorian Christian texts, including texts about memorial, some sort of memorial rituals for animals, often livestock. So there are lots of examples. But in Japan, these became particularly common during the early modern period, so the Edo period, which started around 1600 and ended in the mid-19th century. I actually wrote a book, which you see down there. I'm not saying this so that you buy it. I just wanted to, if you wanted to take a look at it, Bones of Contention. I tell a little bit about the history of this. But what I tried to say is, you see in the Edo period, people are really using animals as commodities to a much greater degree. And right around this period, they also start really getting interested in commemorative rituals. So the example that you see here is one of the early commemorative rituals for animals, which is a commemorative ritual for whales in whaling communities. So these whaling communities would engage in coastal whaling. They didn't really have deep sea whaling that we see perhaps nowadays and starting in the 19th century, when a lot of Western powers, the US actually first and foremost was really one of the countries that was heavily engaged in whaling. I think it was the 5th largest industry, and in New England it was the 3rd largest industry, and whale oil was sort of oiled what was the oil of the Industrial Revolution. And we don't really think of that very much. But that was actually the case. Well, in Japan, in the Edo period, that was predated this deep sea whaling. They mostly engaged in coastal whaling, and they also harvested beached whales. But these whaling communities would really use up the entire whale. But they also carried out memorial rituals for the whales that they killed. Particularly, sometimes they would end up killing a calf or a mother and its calf. And that was seen as particularly problematic. The parent-child relationship is a very important relationship across East Asian traditions. So if that is kind of harmed, that's seen as particularly sinful. And so they would conduct memorial rituals. And you can see this here. You see on the right side, these clerics from different Buddhist temples engaged in chanting and holding a ritual. And then they're setting afloat these paper streamers in the ocean, letting them float away to save the spirits of the whales. They even gave them posthumous names, encouraging their rebirth into a non-human form. Now, rituals for animals that are consumed and killed by humans are still a thing in Japan. So you also see fisheries, slaughterhouses, businesses that, like chicken farms that produce eggs or broiler chickens, they'll all have memorial rituals, and they show up often in the newspaper after there's some sort of, hoof and mouth disease or something. So they have to cull a whole bunch of animals, or there's bird flu, they have to cull a whole bunch of animals. They usually also conduct a memorial ritual because they feel like these animals have been wronged. I mean, we usually kill them anyway, but their lives have been taken prematurely before they could serve some greater purpose, which is to feed us. And so then they also conduct these rituals in those settings. But most recently, it's actually pet memorial rituals which have become very common. You have an aging population with a low birth rate, and Buddhist temples often deal with rituals surrounding death. So some of them have branched out, and they also offer death rituals for animals, for pets. They are considered part of the family, and so people want to remember their pets. What options did you have before that if you're living in an urban area where you cannot just go and bury your dog in an urban park or put it in a flower pot on your veranda? I think not. So what do? Before these kinds of pet cemeteries, they didn't have, or crematoria, they didn't have much options. You had to call up the garbage disposal and say, I want you to come pick up my dog or my cat, and then they'd say, leave it in a cardboard box out by the curb, walk by, and pick it up, and then it'll go in the burnable trash. Would you want that for your beloved pet? No. So services such as this are a much more preferred option for a lot of pet owners, and we can kind of see why. In contemporary Japan, there are lots of Buddhist temples. About 170 of those have pet cemeteries. And it's been a standard practice. And there are also a lot of pet cemeteries that are not affiliated necessarily, they're not at a temple, but they'll still hire a Buddhist cleric to conduct rituals during high holidays. So that's a common thing, and that's a perfectly natural thing for people to do. So what happens? What does a pet service look like? It looks very similar to a human service, with some differences. You have multiple options. So for the human service, you usually don't have a collective one. You usually have an individual cremation. You don't put people from different families together and cremate them together. That would be seen as rather peculiar. But for the pets, that is an option and a more economical option. And you might say, in a sense, it's more eco-friendly, you know. But you can have also an individual cremation. And then you can have the total human equivalent, which is an intended cremation, where the mourners, the chief mourner and the family show up and actually there to push the button during the cremation, and then also help with the transfer of the cremated remains when they come out, because it's a little different in Japan. Usually when we think of cremations here, it's done by the funeral company, and you actually don't get to see anything. And you think that you get back ashes, and that's how they come out of the crematorium. They actually come out as brittle bones, and then they're processed. That's actually a kind of violent process. In the Japanese case, they're maintained as bones, and I'll show you an image later. If you don't want to see it, close your eyes. But you would have a service, and you can see here there's a funeral altar, which looks very similar to a human funeral altar. And there's the crematorium, looks very modern. And then once the cremation is done, you have various options. You can have your pet interred at a collective ossuary or columbarium. You can have pet graves of varying sizes, or you could have an indoor columbarium with a little shelf, individual shelf space where you put the ashes and a memorial tablet, and you could put little offerings and flowers and your pet's favorite toys, all at different prices. Now, show you a couple of examples. This particular temple is called Shinyoji. It's in an area of Tokyo. And one of my pet birds is actually buried there. How do people actually end up at these temples with the pet memorial rites? Sometimes it's just an option provided by a vet. When this pet bird died, my pet bird got very sick. I took it to the vet. It was in an incubator for 2 weeks and then finally had to be put down. And then the vet said, what do you want to do with the bird? Do you want to take it back home? Do you want us to dispose of it? Or do you want it interred at this Buddhist temple in the collective columbarium? And they conduct rituals periodically for it. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Yeah, put it in the columbarium at the Buddhist temple. Years later, I went back there. So my pet bird is actually interred at this collective pet grave, which you see up there. They also have an individual columbarium with shelf spaces, but I didn't do that. It is just interred there. So Homer is interred at this space. Now I promised to show you what cremation looks like. This was also at Shinyoji. They allowed me to attend a cremation of a dog. And you can see here is a little Shiba Inu that's being cremated. And by its head is a little bag with its favorite chewies that are being cremated with it. Once the dog comes out, you'll have little bones, charred bones, and a lot of the crematoria staff took real pride in getting the consistency of the bones such that they would not be broken and too brittle. So they controlled the temperature, and some of them even tried to really lay out the bones so they would just not be a messy hovel of bones, but anatomically, you could lay out all the spine bones and the rib cage and the head and the legs, and then lay them all out. And then the family would come in if it was an attended cremation. And it was a real moment of transition, as it would be during a human cremation, where people came to the realization that their pet was really transformed from this dead pet to these pure white bones. And where they were often crying when as the animal is pushed into the crematorium, when they saw those bones, there was really a mental changeover that was really noticeable. A real interest in anatomy and in the bones themselves, and a real process of healing and coming to terms with this process of transition. And then the chief mourners would take these chopsticks, which you see, and transfer the bones together, two people, each grabbing one end of the bone with chopsticks and transferring it to the urn. And that is only done during a funeral. human and pet. So when you are at a Japanese dinner table, don't ever pick up a food item with somebody else at the other end. Pick up the asparagus stick, both with your chopsticks, because you're enacting an action that would be happening at a funeral. Don't do that. It's sort of considered very bad table manners. So don't do that. And also, if you look very closely, you see that the chopsticks of different shades. One is wood, one is bamboo. So don't ever use mismatched chopsticks. Might look fancy, but don't do that. That's also a funeral thing. So always match them, have matching chopsticks at the dinner table for the living. And what was the interesting thing, one of the clerics said, you know, the best indication that we all have Buddha nature is because if you look, all mammals have one bone in their body. Every bone is different if you're of a different species. But one bone has exactly the same shape in each mammal. And that is, I think, a bone near the top of the spinal cord. And that's called the nodo botoke in Japanese, the throat Buddha. And if you set it on its side, the angles are a little bit difficult, but use your imagination. It looks like a little bit like a Buddhist priest who's folding his hands in prayer. And so the cleric said that is an indication that we all have Buddha nature. And he always used that as a way to convince people when they were all too high and mighty, thinking that humans are more important than other living beings. He said, do you think it's because your nodo botoke is bigger than your dogs or your cats or your hamsters? Well, what about a whale? And then they'd shut up, or an elephant. And then they'd usually shut up. So he used his humor. But that is kind of what that bone looks like. One is a side for the back view, and the other one's kind of from the front. One's a cat, one's a dog. Usually people, after that cremation and after the interment, people memorialize the animals and in altars. And a lot of times the animals are represented through memorial tablets, which you can see here. And if it's an altar at the columbarium, also often the ashes or the cremains in urns, which are behind the tablets, are usually covered in a very nice brocade cover. It looks very pretty. And they have images of the animals to remember them. And then people come together during regular celebrations, monthly and annual memorial services that are collective, where just all the pet owners come together and hold them. But you can also have your pet's name engraved on this memorial tablet, and you can install that at home. And usually the Buddhist clerics may give you a sort of clear instructions. When the memorial tablet is in your home altar, they should not go in the Buddhist altar, or they can go in the Buddhist altar, but if you put them there, put them on the bottom shelf and then have the human tablets a little higher, and then the Buddha even higher, so that you have a kind of hierarchy. But people don't usually care. Their pets are important to them. So sometimes they just, if you look at people's home altars, they have the pet tablet anywhere, right next to grandma or grandpa, and it's perfectly fine. So one thing is that often people in modern day want to be buried with their pets. You also see this in America, but in Japan, it's actually a really popular thing, and you find different instantations. So this is at a Buddhist temple in rural Niigata prefecture, and you see that they have found different solutions. So sometimes in one, you can see this one up here, there's the pet grave right next to the family grave, or this one also has the pet grave right next to the family grave. And this one here, there's a kind of stone that you see, halfway processed stone. That is the pet memorial stone that's put into the plot, but not in the family grave where the human remains are kept. So it's right beside it, so they want to be buried together. Other cemeteries actually allow total interment together, and this is interesting. So here the people come, they purchase a plot, and if you're not dead yet, but you've purchased your plot, you have your name engraved. If there is a red character, that means you're still alive. Okay? So you can see this here. And sometimes it's the humans that are still alive and the pets are already dead. And then they just have to fill in the date when they died by the side of it. So you know where you're going to go. And this was one of the people that I met there. And she is next to the plot that she bought for herself and her 2 Shih Tzus. And you can see the Shih Tzus portrayed on the stone. And both of them had red characters, so they're all alive. But she knows where she's going to be with her dogs. And sometimes it's not that easy. So they also sell these little urns where you can put processed remains of ashes. You put them inside these urns, and you can have these urns produced to actually look like your dog or your cat, and you can put them on top of the family grave if you want to. So they have different kinds of solutions for that. Now, what interested me, I was doing this research, and I was like, so what happens in America? I was thinking, well, we have pet cemeteries, and sometimes they have a bad reputation because of a certain Stephen King novel. But they're pet cemeteries. What about religious communities? Would they ever allow some kind of memorial spaces as the Japanese do? So I went out looking. So first of all, there are well-known older cemeteries. Like one really well-known one is Hartsdale Cemetery, is probably the oldest one in the United States, founded in the late 19th century near New York City, I think in Westchester County. And there was actually an Episcopal priest who, I don't know if he still does it, but he would do by demand, he would do funeral services for pets. And then most recently also a rabbi who offered similar services for Jewish clients as well. This particular cemetery is also one of the older cemeteries in New England. It's no longer active, but it goes back quite a while. It actually also purports to have the pet dog of Lizzie Borden at the cemetery. But you see a lot of headstones that have religious imagery or talk about animals as family members, as you can see here, my son Joshua, or Sasha Kaufman with the Star of David, or there might be others that have a crucifix on the tombstone or on the grave. So there is religious imagery. Another one that was the only one that had clearly a Buddhist meaning. So this one says basically, be quickly born into the Western Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha. That has a clear religious sentiment about rebirth. What about the religious imagery on the other ones? You walk also past some of the clearly Jewish headstones, and they have lots of stones piled on top of them. To what extent is actually religious sentiment? To what is it just something that you do? To what extent is it something that is promoted by the company that produces the headstone because you should have a crucifix or a Star of David on the headstone because that is associated with a headstone? There might also be sometimes people put yard-side candles onto the pet grave. Hard to say, hard to measure. It's still a pet cemetery, right? So we don't know. In Buddhist communities, perhaps we're not so surprised that they might also hold in America a pet memorial service of some sort. And it bears some of the elements of pet memorial rituals in Japan. Although they often choose different kinds of days that are not usually associated with that. So in Japan, a lot of the collective services are held monthly or on big holidays such as the equinoxes during the spring and autumn, because that's a period of transition and a good image for rebirth and paradise, because you're going from light to dark, dark to light, and so it's a transitional period. And then in midsummer, which is sort of also an important point, the opposite of New Year's is the Festival of the Dead. So that's also when you often want to have a pet memorial ritual. So that mirrors what you do with humans. In this case, some Buddhist communities in the United States, they pick Nirvana Day. And that is because the way that the Buddha reaching nirvana is portrayed in paintings, which you can see here. They actually talk about this. You see the Buddha stretched out on his deathbed, and there are all these human mourners, bodhisattvas, and beings mourning the Buddha's passing. And animals on the bottom, they're also mourning the Buddha. So the animals are part of all the beings that mourn the Buddha and can be brought into the sanctuary. So some of them choose to remember the animals on the Buddha's day of passing. But not always. Sometimes they pick other days that's just important to them, like a day, for instance, to remember all living entities, also trees and other plants. But then I wondered, how about other religious communities? So when I first started looking, I found 2 in the New York area, and I'll show you some examples. And then when I started looking again, over a decade later, I found 45 pet memorial gardens, particularly at Episcopal churches, and a lot of them in the South. That really surprised me, and you see this map here. And then there were also a few synagogues that had memorial plaques. They did not have cemeteries on their premises, but they had memorial plaques. So I'll show you some images of some of these sites. So this is probably one of the earliest ones, St. Francis Pet Cemetery at St. Andrew's Church in Newark, Providence. And they started in 1973. They have a memorial book that goes back. The reverend there was a real animal lover, and he started the option of interring pets on church grounds. And then another one was also found in Richmond Town, New York, that was a little bit more recent. The reverend there, another Episcopal church, the reverend there was a hospital chaplain, and through his chaplaincy, he encountered a woman who approached him and said, I just lost my mother, and I feel terrible because I grieved more for my pet dog than I grieve for my mother. And that made him sort of think that people really grieve for their animals. And he established an animal cemetery on church grounds. Eventually, the Episcopal Church actually, right around the same year that they adopted a liturgy for the blessing of the animals, they also adopted a liturgy for a pet funeral. But not all communities use that. They may have their own ritual or use another one that's very common. But it usually is focused on celebrating God's creation. And you find some communities a lot of communities actually name their memorial garden the St. Francis Memorial Garden in different places. And some allow sort of the placement of, say, a little stone marker that remembers the pet, but not the actual remains. Others may have actually a place where you can put the ashes, but only cremated ashes. That's pretty common, not an intact animal. What surprised me, or actually didn't surprise me very much during the COVID pandemic, they also found ways of memorializing animals online because nobody could come together. So a lot of things moved online. And then, but the one thing that surprised me was in some Jewish communities, there are also very few, it's not very common, very few of different congregations, some of them Reform, but not all, some of different kinds, where they would have some sort of memorial plaque that is separate from anything to do with human memorialization, but they'll have something. The one in the center also references the Rainbow Bridge. I know the one on this one here references the Rainbow Bridge. And they come usually with rituals that are very different from human rituals. So generally there's a sense that some of the rituals you might use for a human and saying the Kaddish would be completely inappropriate for saying for a pet. That would just make no sense and it would be very offensive. You should also not bury the pets in a human cemetery. That's seen as denigrating the human. But there are some spaces that allow some space or the performance of some sort of new ritual. And that you also see in some of the churches that do this, where a reverend holds a ritual. They often have rituals that are cobbled together from multiple traditions, where it may be an Episcopal minister who's reciting a Hindu poem or some other kind of poem from a different kind of religious tradition, as suits the particular pet owner. And around the pets, that seems to be okay. Now, we wonder, what does that tell us about how these different traditions think of animals as religious subjects? Are these animals religious subjects of their own right, or are we in these rituals doing something to animals rather than with them? And there may be different kinds of moments and different kinds of rituals where we sometimes feel like we're doing something with animals, but the outside observer might interpret it that you're doing something to animals. I think the life releases are a particular sort of instantation of that. I think it depends on your worldview a little bit how you interpret that ritual. But I always return to Jonathan Z. Smith, that rituals are a means of performing the way things ought to be, in conscious tension to the way things are, in such a way that this ritualized perfection is recollected in the ordinary, uncontrolled course of things. The rituals are pointing us into a certain kind of direction that hopefully make us do better by the animals in some way or another. So I leave you with that thought. And thank you very much for listening. And if you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
One, two. So who would like to ask a question?
You mentioned that in many of the Buddhist cultures, they can obtain karma by the release of animals.
Yes.
Once those animals are released, is there any thought as to the environment that has been provided to protect them and maintain them? We have, of course, a lot of organizations here in the U.S. that do provide environment for native species, but I'm not aware of the Buddhist or Christian organizations worldwide that have really gotten into the conservation of an environment.
That's actually a really good question. And I could say there isn't a definitive answer. So some Buddhist monks that write about this ritual, promoting it, even in the past, were deeply concerned with the well-being of the animals that were being released. So you don't want to, for instance, make sure that the ritual is so splendid and wonderful and wait for everyone to come, and half the animals die as they're waiting to be released. They say, if you do that, your ritual has absolutely no, it's worthless because you're killing the animals. Also, religious rituals for animal species, such as, like, say, livestock, cows and horses. You would not say, okay, cow, now I release you into the wild, good luck. That wouldn't work. So you have to put it in a sanctuary and care for it for the rest of its life. Now, this was in the pre-modern period when you didn't have the issue of invasive species in the same kind of way that you have it nowadays. So there's some modern Buddhist organizations that are deeply against life releases, where they, in China and Taiwan, for instance, where they say, instead of having these releases of animals, what you should do, give some money to conservation organization instead, if you want to do something good for animals. So they may actually reject them. Or others, like this temple that I showed earlier, have this breeding program for native species that are then released into a pond where they're safe and they're going to be taken care of. So it really depends. Others have a nilly-willy release of of species that shouldn't be released into the wild that causes all kinds of problems. It depends on education and awareness, and that varies highly across economic and educational, economic and educational spectrum. So I think it's a complicated answer.
I have a question which is probably not easily answered, but there is concern for livestock and dogs and cats and birds and fish, and the big snake in the St. John the Divine ritual there. Is there a cutoff point, or the turtles and all, below which there's not the same, as Albert Schweitzer used to say, reverence for life? I'm thinking, does this get down to insects and houseflies and mosquitoes and all of that sort of thing? And I'm sure it depends on who you ask and so forth. But I'm curious, is there, at what point is it a different issue?
So that's actually a really good point. So if you look at the vast majority of, for instance, life releases and memorial rituals, is often for species that have some sort of relationship with humans. So that's livestock, food animals like fish and birds that are caught in the wild and for human consumption. It's pets, other animals that we have a relationship with. That's most of them. Or other kinds of charismatic animals, zoo animals, for instance. Other species like whales in a whaling community that have a lot of charisma. So that's common. But interestingly, the kinds of books that I'm working on right now that promote releasing living species, they love to give examples of people who saved flies and fleas and lice, refused to kill them, and then these little insects saved their lives. For instance, there's a very famous story in a work by a late Ming Dynasty cleric. So he lived right around 1600. That's a foundational text that's called the Tract on Refraining from Killing and Releasing Life. And he, in that text, gives a whole bunch of anecdotes, edifying anecdotes. And one of them is about a wine brewer who would always save the flies that would fall into his vats of wine that he was brewing. He'd spit them out and he put powdered dust on them, rice dust, to dry them out and wait for them to revive, and he released all of these flies. So one day he gets falsely accused of a crime. He's brought before the judge and sentenced to death. And as this judge is writing down the sentence, all these flies descend upon the judge and fly around his hand, and he can't write down the sentence. And he was like, what is going on? So they ask him, what happened? And so they find out that he saved all these flies. So they take that as a sort of divine intervention, and his death sentence is annulled. So the flies saved his life. So stories like that show up all the time. And in some of the Japanese writers that I look at, there's one who says, you're never too poor to save an animal and release it. If you don't have any money, you can find a mouse, you can find a cockroach, you can find mosquitoes, you can find flies and fleas and lice, and you can release those animals too. It costs you nothing. So nothing should prevent you from doing this practice. So for them, even animals that are considering a nuisance are animals that are worth killing. And it's interesting because he also writes about, some of them write about, well, humans think they're so big and important, and we will take a little flea or a lice and we'll squeeze it between our fingernails and kill it without second thought. Well, what about the demigods? They're so much bigger than us. Do you think it would be right for them to take us and just squeeze us between their fingernails? And they make you think like, oh, what if I were in that position? So they're trying to inspire empathy and compassion for these little creatures, even the ones that we really don't care for so much. So for them, there's a total spectrum. Now, in the modern day, yes, extermination companies in Japan often seek the services of Buddhist clerics to conduct memorial rituals for all the nuisance pests that they have killed to atone for that. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. So there is some consideration. There's a sense that it's bad, but the rituals can also serve to give you a you go scot-free kind of card when you conduct the ritual. So again, J.Z. Smith, I say. Yes.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I was fascinated by how many Episcopal cemeteries there are,
Yeah.
as an Episcopalian myself. But my question has to do with the lack of belief in the soul
Yes.
of the animals. And I'm wondering, do you find that this is evolving at all? As I like to think that Christian faith, in any case, is evolving in that direction.
Yes. I think theologically it remains an issue. And if you think of Pope Francis, who kind of seemed to go in the direction of saying, of course pets go to heaven, but then when questioned, sort of retracted a little bit as well. So it becomes sort of a touchy issue, because for a lot of people, that how can that be heaven if my beloved family members are not there? How can that be heaven? So I think there is some openness, and you can't control what people actually think. And I think one way of sidestepping this is this idea of the rainbow bridge. And some of you may have encountered this. Often when you go and you have your pet cremated, the crematorium may give you this little poem with a rainbow on it, and it's a rainbow bridge. And it's a poem basically that goes along something like this, that when a pet dies, it goes to a meadow, a beautiful meadow under a rainbow, and it plays with all the other animals. The rabbits play with the dogs, and the birds play with the cats, which is kind of a peculiar image to keep in your head, because the cats love to chase birds. It actually gives them fun, but now they're playing with them in a very peaceful way. So it's kind of almost like the Garden of Eden, and everything's happy. And then one day, when the owner dies, the animal's ears perk up. And as the spirit of the owner is approaching that beautiful meadow, the pet runs towards them and greet them, and then they both cross the rainbow bridge together into heaven, I guess. That's left somewhat open. So that is not particularly based in Christian theology, so to say. It's used a lot as a sort of psychological tool to help people cope with the grief they experience after losing their pet. It's been translated into all languages. I've encountered it at Buddhist pet cemeteries in Japan. So it's worldwide and all over the internet, as sort of sidestepping some of these theological questions, I would say, and as a beautiful image that you can hold in your mind when you lose your pet.
I'm her brother, so similar question about the soul, but in a different perspective. Sometimes I hear these kind of things, and I think the idea of the soul that comes from Western religion creates in itself a hierarchy that leads to the indifference and the subjugation, and despite which is really an unfortunate thing. And I just wanted, I understand as maybe the only creature that thinks, what happens to me when I die? I understand the birth of religions, because people think they have that ability to think about that. But it's a pretty pernicious outcome in some ways because of that. The special, we are so special.
Yes.
God's image and all this, and God's made it, whatever it is. And it's always bothered me.
Yeah. And I think you find different answers in different religious traditions, and different emphasis. So I guess for some Christian theologians, some would focus very much on what happens to you in the hereafter, and others say, what about creation? They're all God's creatures. So if you lean into that, that's a hopeful way of finding kinship. If you just say, oh, it's about salvation, then perhaps it splits open that difference. So you can find kinship, you can find difference. In the Buddhist tradition too, you can find kinship and say all living beings were once our mothers and our fathers and we're made of the same substance. Or you can say, well, the animal birth is a really lowly birth. It is an unfortunate destiny. That opens up difference.
Is it true that the Buddhist tradition, as you presented, is a little more, what's the word?
Fluid.
Connected, or
Fluid, it's interconnected.
Yeah.
It's not a finite, it's not that finite existence, because you may be a human in this lifetime, but you don't know what you're going to be in the next lifetime. Maybe you're going to fall into that animal realm, and when you kill that ox in this lifetime, guess what you're going to be in that next lifetime. So there is sort of this inspiration to do right by every creature, right, or every living being. They don't really think of them as creatures because that's creation, right? They think of them as living beings. So life is very special. And the first precept, Buddhist precept, is always not taking life, whether that's a human life or an animal life. So not killing any living beings. So, yes. I think there's one more question and then we can finish up.
I've come across references of, in Buddhism, of animals in the bardo, and was wondering whether that's really part of Orthodox Buddhist theology or what.
Well, you know, there are different forms of Buddhism, and this idea of the bardo or this transitional state is particularly emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism. The examples that I gave today are primarily from the Chinese tradition, or Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism, which is a slightly different branch of Buddhism. So yes, you could say it is a traditional form of Buddhism, but just a different branch.
So it is actually part of a tradition rather than some sort of New Age super.
I haven't looked that much into it because I don't work on Tibetan Buddhism. You could probably ask my colleague Jeffrey Barstow, who works on animals and Tibetan Buddhism, and I can recommend his books. But Buddhism is a very diverse tradition, and Tibetan Buddhism is sort of, or different streams of Tibetan Buddhism are sometimes slightly different from some of the traditions that I look at. So I can probably speak better to those traditions that I have more familiarity with.
The last question, but let me ask a very quick question, which we want to give a complicated answer to, but we're a little late. But I was always brought up to feel that there was progress in religious thought. In terms of Judaism, you know, they had the temple, sacrifice of animals, sacrifices were all the time in more primitive societies. We call primitive societies. And it was the way you expiating the guilt you felt for being human or sinful. And now we've gone on to religions that don't require sacrifices of animals as central to them. And so we say we've made real progress. Although treatment of animals, it's like chickens today and all sorts, it's pretty awful. So have we made progress by no longer sacrificing?
That's actually a really great question because I love talking about sacrifice.
It's got to be a quick answer.
So quick answer. I tell you in my class on animals in Japanese religion, we usually also talk about sacrifice. And the students usually come at that question and they think that sacrifice is barbaric and horrible. Then we actually start reading texts about sacrifice. And they start thinking, oh, some of these societies that relied on sacrifice actually do not think of animals as lowly creatures. They actually see animals as beings that help them connect to the divine. They actually hold animals in very high regard. They treat the animals that are sacrificed as very important, treat them really nice, bring them up very carefully. They're perfect in every way. And then they're killed in a very specific constrained, violent way, but promised a really glorious afterlife. And then they start reading about Buddhism and other forms, and they go like, the Buddhists actually don't think very highly of an animal existence. And they go back to these sacrificial traditions, and they go, actually, they have a much better view of animals. They may have, when you actually look at some of these particular cultures, they actually didn't eat a whole lot of meat at that time. They were actually relatively limited in their meat consumption to ritual occasions. Whereas we don't like sacrifice. A lot of us eat meat all the time. And as you say, when it's industrially produced under horrible conditions, we do far worse than the few animals that are slaughtered and sacrificed. So whether we have evolved, I'm always very, very cautious when I think of evolving and thinking we're much better than some other contexts that were in the past or that we perceive as primitive. Often it's not the case. So I think you can find something positive within a sacrificial tradition. Does that mean I want to go out and sacrifice some animals? No, no. But that's kind of my answer. I would say no. Yeah.
Hard question.
It's a hard question. It's a hard question.
All right. Well, thank you again. And before we conclude, I know there's anyway, the next lecture in this series is in September, but we have 2 lectures coming up in April and May in the Jewish series. The next one in the Jewish series, 2 months from now, Sunday, April 12th at 3:30 in the Parker Performance Hall at the Brevard Music Center. It's going to be title's not set yet, but I think Magical Melodies, Broadway Music in the Age of Sondheim. And it'll be both a lecture and a performance of a group coming from Greenville. It should be really spectacular. And then on May 8th, we have another lecture titled Jews and Booze. Sounds a little flippant, but it's the title of her book. It's really about wine, alcohol, and its impact on Judaism, over American Judaism anyway. The 2 really interesting topics. We don't have a site for that one yet. So I want to thank Barbara so much for this really stimulating afternoon. We're all grateful to you for coming. Come back up. And we framed this for you. If you like, you can put it in your office to remember us, or put it somewhere. And we'll always remember your trip. I hope you enjoyed it too, and coming to Brevard. We have a lovely community. You got to see it a little bit. And thank you again.